folks. Welcome. It's 6 o'clock. We've still got lots of folks who are joining us, but I'm going to kick us off for the sake of timeliness. Good evening, everyone. My name is Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you are here with us this evening. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, communities, and depth, and the value of preservation in our neighborhoods. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. Well, we call our home the village, but it is also unceded traditional land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. I want to acknowledge in this archival recording the Lenape and Munsee communities, and especially their elders, past and present, and express gratitude for their stewardship of this land, for contributing to its geography, and for the use of their language as place names. If you'd like to find out more about this, please reach out. I'm glad to offer resources. So just a little bit of Zoom protocol. Please feel free to use the chat and say hi. I won't be visible during the talk, but I will be here. Tell us where you're joining from, or use that to raise any issues or thoughts. But if you have questions specifically for our speakers, we ask that you please use the Q&A function below. It just helps me to keep track of your questions. And you can submit those at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very pleased to introduce our speakers for this evening. Sarah Krasnostein is the best-selling, multi-award-winning author of The Trauma Cleaner and The Believer. She has a PhD in criminal law and is admitted to legal practice in New York and Victoria. Her work has appeared in a variety of publications in Australia, the UK, and the United States, including The Monthly, The Saturday Paper, Tablet Magazine, Long Reads, Mean Gin, and Oxford Handbooks Online, as well as various academic journals. She has lectured in criminal law and taught creative writing. Sarah was born in America, is based in Australia, and has lived and worked in both countries. Rebecca Pack is the Director of Donor Engagement at the Women's Prison Association, growing the Women's Prison Association's community and building relationships with businesses, inspiring them to partner with the WPA to address the cycles of trauma, poverty, and incarceration that devastate women and families in New York City and beyond. Rebecca also leads events and campaigns with WPA's junior board, the Emerging Philanthropists. She holds a Bachelor of Criminology and Criminal Justice from Griffith University. But before we get talking with Sarah and Beck, we've got a special video from the Women's Prison Association. So Diana, roll that with us. Thank you so much, everyone.
The Women's Prison Association, WPA, was founded 175 years ago in the heart of New York City as the nation's first organization for systems-involved women. We empower women to redefine their lives in the face of injustice and incarceration. Together, we forge pathways toward freedom, safety, and independence. We believe women belong with their families and not behind bars.
Well, when you lock up a woman, you're locking up her family, you're locking up her children, you're limiting where she can find housing, you're limiting where she can find employment. You put her in a situation where she's re-traumatized and re-victimized again. You can't reform something that's broken. Spark or crack in the wall. The crack is still gonna be there. And as soon as the weather change or the temperature changes, it's gonna come back.
I refer to what most people call the criminal justice system as the criminal legal system because there is no justice in the system, and so it feels completely inaccurate to call it that. The goals of our ATI program are to treat people with dignity and respect, and to try to offer a safe and enough space. We really are women supporting women, and it translates into the work that we do as well. And every time that we get somebody out of Rikers, it gives me so much joy. I can't even begin to tell you.
We offer safe spaces to live, heal, and grow.
I come from a two-parent household, middle class. Education was the cornerstone, and a man attempted to rape me, and I fought for my life, and I wound up in prison. And so I think that people have these preconceived notions and these misconceptions that everyone who has been through prison, or they're undesirable, or they must have done something bad in their life, and it can happen to anyone. Hopper Home is a transitional residence shelter for women coming home from prison, from jail, and have nowhere else to go. It's comprised of 38 women, and it's home, away from home, where they feel safe, where they know that people care. You don't get to address your issues in prison. Nothing correctional about the Department of Corrections. So people come home with the same traumas, on top of trauma. And so we try to operate with trauma-informed care. We try to come from a strength perspective where, we encourage the women, we empower them.
I now realize things that contributed to me being arrested were me being a single parent, me being poor, me being Black, me being a survivor of sexual assault. There was a lot of factors that contributed to how I ended up there, but I wasn't aware of them in the moment. And I was just trying to make sure I could feed my kid. These kids need something to do. We need programs. We need more therapists, more Black therapists. We need mental health to be taken more seriously in communities of color.
We honor each woman's experience and empower her to make supportive community connections.
Studies have shown that 60% of women who are incarcerated were unemployed at the time of their arrest, and 37% of those women actually made less than $600 per month prior to their arrest. A woman that I really often reflect back on had been in a really extremely violent relationship. She had been beaten and had to have reconstructive surgery on many parts of her body, but she still wanted to do something that would help to change her life, change her son's life, and she was here and ready to pursue employment. She was actually one of the stars of that training program, and she's still currently working full-time, doing work that she loves, and she's still in therapy as well. And so for us, that's amazing because this woman's life had nearly been taken from her, and we were able to be a part of helping her to create a new trajectory for herself and for her son.
It is a place that really makes me feel at home. When I'm there, it just seems right. I have had the pleasure of running into a lot of women who have been released since my release, and it just brings me so much joy to see them and to see us all working and being a part of something and receiving help and moving forward with our lives.
WPA for me was literally life-altering. They assist essentially with everything. The job that I have right now happened because of WPA. I'm extremely grateful.
What I would like people to know is that WPA is more than just the agency. It's more than just an organization. It's a safe haven.
Join us in redefining justice for women.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Orbeck and I am the Director of Donor Engagement at the Women's Prison Association, or WPA for short. Before I get into my talking points, just wanted to shout out and thank the amazing women that you saw in that video who I know are part of the audience tonight, so thank you. As you may know, WPA's historic townhouse and headquarters was damaged in the early hours of Saturday, December 5. As you can see there, by a fire that started on the corner of 7th Street. It was an electrical fire, and then it spread around to 2nd Avenue, to the Middle Collegiate Church, our next door neighbor, and then to WPA. We're really thankful that no one was hurt, and within one day, WPA ensured that all of our residents had somewhere to stay. And then less than 1 month later, we reopened in a temporary location in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And that was thanks to our hardworking frontline staff. And these are folks who had already been working furiously during the pandemic for almost a year at this point. And in a year where our essential workers already had gone above and beyond, this was a truly heroic effort, and it continues to be. As you can see and imagine, there's been extensive damage, and a deep recovery effort is required to get us back online at 2nd Ave. Right now, we're at the mercy of Middle Collegiate's timeline. Their damage is significantly worse than ours, and their demolition and rebuild may affect the integrity of our building. And because both of our buildings are historically landmarked, very important, safely and securely removing and then restoring our front facades is paramount. Now, we may be unsure what the future holds for our historic home, but WPA hasn't stopped, because giving up is not in our DNA. We are tremendously grateful for the outpouring of concern and support we received. This special relationship between WPA and our neighbours is a part of our rich history. And I know that's what you're all here for, but I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes to talk about the scope of our services today. And then I'll introduce the main event, Sarah Krasnostein, who is going to walk you through our history. When WPA was founded, our goal was much more narrow than it is today. Our founders wanted to understand and improve conditions of confinement of women living in New York City. And today, we envision a society where our reliance on incarceration has been replaced by constructive, community-driven responses. The easiest way to think about our work, and I'm going to tell you a lot and not expect you all to remember all of it, but if you're going to remember anything, remember freedom, safety, and independence. They're the 3 buckets that our services fall under. An example of freedom, our amazing alternative to incarceration program, which is the one Miriam referenced in the video. When a woman is being held, it's at Rikers Island, which is New York City's jail. And instead of sitting there being separated from her family, we can advocate for her to be sentenced to us and not mandated to a prison sentence and away from her kids. Safety, for those of you who did give in response to the fire, you already know that shelter is one of our core services. In addition to our adult residence, which is the one that was impacted by the fire, we also have a family residence in the East Village. And at both of them, we host a range of different services to support women and their children in those residential services and in our others. WPA's approach is very personal, and it's customized to each woman's unique needs. And then our third bucket is independence. And this is really important to us. WPA, we do not do the work for women. Women are experts in their own lives. We respect that. We empower them to build careers, to advocate for themselves. and to share their stories to make change. So before I hand over to Sarah, just a teeny bit more, 2020 marked our 175th anniversary, a year of unprecedented struggle in New York City, in the United States, and beyond. It was not the milestone year we were expecting and planning for, but WPA is no stranger to adversity. For example, in 1945, that was WPA's centennial and also the end of World War II. Even then, we never closed our doors, not once. So despite the challenges of war, of politics, of public health, WPA has remained a steady presence for women facing injustice and incarceration in New York City. And now I would like to introduce Sarah Krasnostein, historian and author, and she's going to walk us through WPA's history. And one of the perks of this event being virtual is that Sarah can participate from her home in Australia. And don't let this accent confuse you. I'm here in New York, Queens to be exact, and Sarah's in Melbourne, home to the best coffee in the world. Do not hate me, New Yorkers.
Thanks. Thank you, Beck. I feel like we've switched places. I feel very far away. So you get an American talking with this accent from Melbourne and Beck representing from New York. But I'm very happy to be here because I feel very far away. And, my work has been in the city for, the past few years. And this is a wonderful chance for me to feel, like a small part of me is still there. So for the past few years, I've been working on this history of female crime and punishment in New York City. And it's not possible to do that, as I learned very early on in the project, without looking at the significant contribution of the Women's Prison Association to systemic reform and to the individual lives of thousands of women since it was established in 1845. And as Beck has touched on, that work has been and continues to be vital because of all of the different ways that a seemingly neutral criminal justice system uniquely impacts women. And those ways, unfortunately, have not changed over the last century and a half when we talk about the city. So they've been the same factors in various iterations have been disproportionately affecting women who come into contact with the system since the first penal institutions began appearing in New York City from the late 1700s. Some of those issues were, and they continue to be, pregnancy, motherhood, the enormous stressors of single parenting, sexual assault, domestic violence, intergenerational trauma, mental illness, self-medication, and drug and alcohol addiction when proper health treatment is not available, housing insecurity, education and employment inequality, and coercive forms of force resulting in women bearing the debt or criminal liability of their male partners. So a focus of my research, which could be very broad and take many decades, I've narrowed in on specific areas, and Hopper Home, luckily for me, has been one of them. It has been the site of the same type of work for the past 150 years, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So strong and consistent has been the character of Hopper that I think of the research in this area less in terms of, like a black letter history, and very much in terms of a biography of a place. It's almost a type of a person. So I write narrative nonfiction, and a lot of us who, are interested in reading decades later remember the big stars of that genre. We talk about Joan Didion or, Tom Wolfe, but one name that has not survived and that I think deserved to is Meyer Berger, who wrote for the Times about the life of the city in the middle of decades of the last century. I recommend his book about the story, just daily life in the city. It's called The 8 Million. It's been out of print for a long time, but if you can find it, it's definitely worth reading. And I'm raising him now because in 1955, he wrote about Hopper. And he said, "A tranquil spot, unchanged, unchanged for more than 100 years in the city of endless change, is the 4-story brownstone with a brass handrail up the high stoop, with an old picket fence and curtained high windows, at 110 Second Avenue between 6th and 7th Streets. So that was in the New York Times in June 1955. He went on, the home is run today pretty much as it was when Abigail Gibbons presided over it 80 years ago. It takes in for shelter on its plain upper floors girls and women freshly released from New York prisons, and gives them the chance to steady their feet before they try to pick up the severed social threads. 66 years after that, much of that remains true. So 110 Second Avenue was built in 1837 and finished off in 1838 as one of 4 row houses, and it was lived in originally by the merchant Ralph Mead and his wife Anne and their extended family. 180 years later, 110, which was originally numbered 108, is the only one of the 4 still standing. So 3.5 stories tall, it's 25 feet wide and 125 feet deep. The brownstone building has been a home and a workplace to thousands of women over the last 150 years. Some stayed for one night, some lived and worked there for their whole adult lives. And this story of continuity and change that has unfolded within its walls, particularly over the last century and a half as its iteration as Hopper Home, has been the story of the city. It's a sort of encyclopedia of the city in that sense. As the blocks around it morphed from elegant residences for the wealthy to the Yiddish theater district and the home to the Hebrew Actors Union, to a primarily Hispanic community, the purpose of Hopper remained the same: to provide a home to women at risk of incarceration or women who had been formerly incarcerated or recently released. And that's the function, as you've heard, that it continues to serve. The building was purchased by the Women's Prison Association in July of 1874 for $32,500. Previously, the association had occupied a much smaller location on 10th Avenue between 21st and 22nd Streets. So summer of 1872 was when 110 Second Avenue officially became the Isaac T. Hopper Home. And it was named after Isaac Tatum Hopper, who founded, with his daughter Abigail Hopper Gibbons, the Women's Prison Association in 1845, with the object of reclaiming discharged female prisoners. So I'm just gonna take a drink. Both Abigail and Isaac were outspoken and plain-spoken. They were Quaker abolitionist prison reformers. And true to character, they wasted no time in this new location. Over 300 women were helped in that first year of its operation. Laundry rooms were set up in the basement, and 2 sewing rooms were set up on the 2nd floor. And that was a way for its residents to earn an income by taking in washing and turning out crisp linens, and taking in what was torn and turning out what was mended. Sorry, just one moment. Sorry, my screen's just gone a bit funny. 1 second. Oh, I apologize. I'll be back in 1 moment.
No, it's fine, Sarah.
Such is the Zoom world.
Yeah.
I know, right? Just when we think it's all working properly. Hold on. Oh, gosh.
Can you tell us again the author of the book called The 8 Million?
Yeah, Meyer Berger, Berger.
Thanks.
Okay, so here I am again. Can you see?
P.S. Thank you for telling me. I've worked at WPA for 10 years. Didn't realize what the T stood for. Tatum. Thank you.
Beck, can you still see me properly? Am I?
Yeah, we can see you. Yes.
All right, here we go. Okay, so.
And we can see the slides too. We can.
Oh, great. Okay. So the first floor, which is the ground floor, now serves as the reception and office space for the director of the home, as well as its residential aides and social workers. It also currently contains the kitchen and common room where the ladies have, in various configurations, eaten and gathered for leisure time or program meetings for the last century. Christmases, Thanksgivings, 4th of Julys, birthdays, each occasion marked by the directors and social workers with special purchases of food, cards, presents, trips to the drugstore across the street for a Coke were a big thing, and a trip to the movies, and there were numerous cinemas in the neighborhood, trips up to the Natural History Museum or to a restaurant, all were little things given to the ladies to kind of break up the daily pattern of their lives for in celebration. And it always strikes me again and again when I'm reading from the archival material from the home, which is in the New York Public Library, that it has always been an actual home. The kitchen and the common area were expanded into the rear courtyard in 1875 and then again in 1882. So while that outdoor space has shrunk, the indoor space kind of expanded to accommodate more women. There were, before the fire, I think, 38 beds at Hopper. And over its history, it sometimes sheltered up to 50 women at a time. There were periods when it had far less, sometimes less than 10, but it's always been that sort of a home, which is why many people who pass it wouldn't even look twice at it, yet alone know what its function was. And I think that given the marginalization and vulnerability of the women that it helps, that's part of the reason it's been able to survive for so long. More broadly, however, I don't think that many of us know about this aspect of our history. So I'm talking specifically about the fact that women have worked at all levels of our social health system and our policing, our legal, judicial, and correctional systems for the last 130 years. And many of those names have just been lost to history. Something I hope that my work can help change. One example that comes up numerous times in the archives is that the physician in charge of Hopper Home in the 1890s was Dr. Annie Daniel. She was one of the first female physicians in America, and she was on staff of the New York Infirmary for Women and Children for over 60 years before she died in 1927. That's the same A.S. Daniels, whom the New York Times assumed incorrectly must be male, when favorably reporting on her findings that the prisoner population was expanding at an alarming rate. That's in 1891, and that reform rather than punishment was the smarter and more just option in many of those cases, given that 60% of the female prisoners in the Workhouse, which was then on Blackwell's Island, Roosevelt Island, 60% of those female prisoners were under 25 and were serving offenses for things like public drunkenness. So she was arguing back then for the establishment of shelters so that police jails didn't double as housing for those in need. When Abigail Gibbons died in 1893, at the age of 92, the home that she helped establish had already helped hundreds of women with the smallest particulars of their lives. The New York Times ran a front page obit eulogizing her as one of the most remarkable women of the 19th century. She was an abolitionist before the Civil War, and during the war, she was a field nurse. And after that, she opened up the School for Immigrants and Sanctuary for Unmarried Mothers. She campaigned against capital punishment, organized the distribution of free food to those in need, and publicized her belief in a solidarity of women that overshadowed that of class, race, and ethnicity. So at this moment, when many of us are belatedly looking at our complicity in systems of racial injustice, we know that solidarity as women turns on acknowledging the impact of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic differences. We are looking again at the ways in which attempts to reform the criminal justice system actually perpetuated carceral institutions that have had a disproportionate and unjust impact on women of color. But we can also see that many of the Women's Prison Association's early attempts at systemic reform were radical for their time. Amongst them were lobbying for female police matrons in New York City jails to reduce sexual assault on female prisoners. That was back in 1888. And the establishment of separate prisons for women, again, to reduce sexual assault. And again, they were unheard of at the time. The Women's Prison Association had a dedicated prison inspector in the late 1800s who would go to each of the jails and prisons, not just in the city, but around New York State, and report back on what was unsanitary and unsafe and what was needed to improve the lives of women there. For 23 years, that person was Agent Alice Woodbridge, a field worker of the Women's Prison Association and of Hopper Home. She was often the only voice drawing attention to the self-defeating nature of punishment for its own sake, drawing out things like how mandatory short sentences for low-level offending disrupted the lives of those who should have been granted access to social support and housing, instead of sent to the punitive and overcrowded environments of the workhouse and the jails in and around Manhattan. In physical terms, one of the most fascinating things to me about Hopper Home is how close the past is when you walk through it. Certain rooms contain fireplaces with the original Greek Revival marble mantles on which can be seen the original gas outlets for the lamps that were lit at night. At the top of the front stoop are the Ionic columns and the Italian wooden double doors. The original call bells that used to dangle downstairs in the kitchen to rouse the maids' servants did hang in the kitchen at Hopper for its first few decades, but they're now gone. And so are the trees of heaven, which were written about early in the last century, where women used to sit on the patio under these trees in the evenings. And I'm not sure what they are. So that's a continuing project, try to find out what a tree of heaven might be. But in the basement, you can still see the brick arch now filled in on one of the walls that may have led to the church next door. And I think it's the original iteration of the church that was there before the church that recently burned. And I've been trying to find proof of whether that might have served a role in the Underground Railroad. Abigail Gibbons had lived in a building in Chelsea on West 29th Street, which was Manhattan's first documented safe house for those escaping slavery. So it's not far-fetched that we might be looking at that here. But as the executive director of Village Preservation has said elsewhere, it's incredibly rare that you can substantiate those theories because the locations were secretive by nature. So enmeshed is the history of the Women's Prison Association with that of the city that reminders of it spread throughout the neighborhood. There's another bricked up entrance, this one in Astor Place Station, which led through to Clinton Hall, where fundraising fairs were held for the Prison Association in 1860. That's when Hopper was still at his Chelsea location. Clinton Hall was the Mercantile Library of New York, which once held over 100,000 books and was where Emerson and Mark Twain had spoken. So for the Women's Prison Association, to have had their annual fair there shows the standing of the association in the city in the late 1800s. And at the same time, the fact that while they were respected, they've always had to lobby for public sympathy and funds to continue to do the work that they do. These elements of continuity amongst much change reflect the fact that Hopper has always been a place of stability for the people who have needed it. This is where women came for food and shelter, clothing, job training and employment, recreation. But the assistance given to them by the social workers on staff has always been much broader. So the voluminous and very detailed records kept in the archives at the public library show the most beautiful and intimate details. There are letters exchanged with clients, sometimes over decades, holiday cards, birthday cards, children that were asked about and brought in for visits long after those women had left. And the most striking and perhaps the saddest thing I found in the archives is unopened and returned cards and letters returned to those workers who had, couldn't trace the women who had left, who had perhaps been reabsorbed into the trauma and gone forever silent. One last striking thing about those archives that you can see is these register books logging entries over decades. And you can see the years just before 1920 when the demographic of the women starts changing from mostly Irish and German immigrant women and the occasional Jewish women from the neighborhood to Latina and African American women. So here, the elements of continuity and change really do trace a map of racial injustice and inequality in housing and education and health. And ultimately, we're talking about the criminalization of poverty. In 1992, I'm just going to end on this. The then executive director of the Women's Prison Association, Ann Jacobs, wrote a letter to the New York Times. The US incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any other country in the world, she wrote. Women are the fastest growing segment of that population. In the last decade, women in prison in New York have increased fivefold. 80% of incarcerated women are mothers. 25% were pregnant or postpartum when they were arrested. The costs of their incarceration are reflected not only in the burgeoning budgets of the correctional system, but are also borne by the foster care system, by the children, and ultimately by all of us. Most of the women are locked up for offenses related to substance abuse or because they finally struck out at a batterer. We're learning that 80% of women in the system have been victims of child abuse, sexual assault, or domestic violence. They need drug treatment, counseling, education, and job training, or resources. Our resources should be invested in housing, health, employment, even parks and recreation. Instead, most of our money goes to warehousing people. So that letter was nearly 30 years ago, but it could have been written today. So while the systemic problems have endured, so too, and I think Beck made this point, has Hopper Home and the Women's Prison Association, and the hopes of the women who left there until recently each morning and returned each night there to their beds, which I find as heartening as it is sad. So hopefully Hopper will get the care it needs to continue to be the home it's always been until the day when it's no longer necessary. And that's me. Thank you.
Sarah, would you mind just changing your view for a second and walk us through each of these images?
Sure. So the one that's currently on the screen is the external front of Hopper. And here's Abigail. This is the neighborhood in the 20s, I think. So you can see, I'm just trying to think if this was the Hebrew Actors Insurance Union on the other side to the church. I'm not sure. I can find that out and I'll take it on notice, and I can let you guys know if anyone's interested. Those are the original row houses on the left side. You can see, that's back when it was, each of these was kind of inhabited by an extended member of the Meads family. I think it was the son-in-law and his in-laws. Sounds like a very high functioning family that they all together, but it's prime real estate. So I'm sure that they just sucked it up. And on the other side, that looks like it would have been 30s or 40s. This an early
this
picture
is Isaac. This is now Isaac Tatham, you said was his middle name, right?
Yes, yeah. Tatem, yeah. Okay, so this is upstairs on the second floor. So, if we're calling the ground floor the first floor, this would be the second floor. So that first picture on the left, if you go up the stairs on the front stoop, you walk through the big wooden doors. This would be immediately on your left. And I think today, before the fire, it was offices for the Women's Association.
This is where we would sit, yeah.
And the fireplace here, you can kind of make out on either side at the ends of the mantelpiece are these gas lamps. What they are, they look like candles maybe in the image, but they're gas lamps. So that would be the lighting before electricity. And okay, here, this is the rear courtyard. That mural is so beautiful. And
that was actually painted by the 8-ball community, who are longtime volunteers with WPA. They did an incredible job. It was a very collaborative process where they came and they ate and they hung out with the ladies, and together they came up with a concept for things that they wanted to see. So ocean, you can see a little peek of Lady Liberty in the right-hand corner because we're New York proud at Hopper. And then on the other side that is out of shot is a painted garden.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's now like a very beautiful space. So that courtyard is surrounded on all four sides by the surrounding buildings. And you can only access it by going through the home. It's a little bit of sky. That's great.
Dee, can we have the next? Oh, here we go.
So this is the original. This is a copy of the original legislation. A very beautiful version of the legislation that pushed through this reform to correctional officers, ensuring that there'll be female police matrons, so female, COs in the local New York City jails. And I think this still hangs on the wall in the director's office.
It does, as does the deed you mentioned, $32,000.
No one tell the archives at the New York Public Library because we'll have them busting down, trying to keep it in perfect conditions. It's a wonderful thing to see. It's a very special piece of history there. Yes, this is currently, this land is Roosevelt Island. I'm sure there's a very fancy apartment building here now. It's the Workhouse, which started off with good intentions for the time, in that it was reformatory in nature rather than strictly penal, but it very quickly became overcrowded, a place where people were, again, warehoused and sent to serve sentences of varying lengths. An interesting thing is that the workhouse was used quite heavily in the mid to late 1800s, as was the Tombs, which were the original prison, one of the original prisons down near the Battery. And women with children would be sent there with their children. So when you think about that in these conditions, it's just horrifying. Yeah. So this is one of the beds at Hopper. I'm not sure what floor this, but is this the fourth floor?
This is the top floor.
Yeah. So, there's beds on are there beds on the second floor, third and fourth floor, or is it just third and fourth?
Yeah, and you're right, it's tricky. Depends if we say, if the ground floor, the floor above is offices, then the next two above that are dormitory style rooms with extremely high ceilings. And then the room above that is what we're looking at now. And that's the top.
So it's dorm style housing, and I think there's two or three rooms on that very top floor that kind of have their own little rooms. And when I was doing my research there, they were reserved for women with full-time work who kind of needed to have that,
a little bit more privacy, working odd hours.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the common. Okay, so that upper left hand is again that room, one of the rooms on the second floor, and I think they all are, aren't they?
I think so too.
This is all the second floor, as it was probably in the early 1900s. Is that the book club photo?
Yes.
Beautiful. So book club has happened there for at least 100 years, which as an author I love. And it was one of, consistent activities provided that the women did communally, but also kind of, an element of normal social life that's continued to very recently, and will hopefully continue once we're all back in the house.
And we're done. And I did see there was a couple of folks in the chat who were interested in more of the imagery. So if we don't get to that, you can reach us at the general WPA website, but my email is rpak@wpaonline.org. Again, actually, I'm just going to put it in here. If anyone has any questions that we don't get to tonight, or if they'd like to make a donation, especially if they'd like to make a donation, this is my email. You should see it in the chat. I just wanted to call out a couple of things that you said, Sarah. The criminalization of poverty, that was a huge part of WPA's work basically from day one. It certainly is now. And that's because the criminal legal or criminal injustice system, it does. It criminalizes race, it criminalizes poverty, it criminalizes opportunity gaps. And that's one of the reasons that WPA really relies and depends upon the support of individuals. You even referenced that as part of our history, like government contracts and that kind of support doesn't always allow us to do the work. And as we described earlier, the work is us respecting women as experts in their own lives. So we really do rely on the support of individuals to be innovative, to respond to emergencies such as a fire, and to continue doing this great work. So you can see there, our donate link is www.wpaonline.org/donate. And if anyone does have any questions that we don't get to, I'm going to hand it over to Arielle, but if we don't get to your question tonight, do please email me.
Thank you both so much for all of this. This is just incredible. And I personally am so grateful for the work that the WPA does. And I know that it's something that we are very proud to have in our neighborhood in the East Village. We
love you guys too. Thank you very much.
I like the mutual love festivals. It's a very important part of being a villager, I think. Okay, let's see. We have many questions. We actually have a couple of questions about the WPA's archive. It seems like you mentioned that there's some at the New York Public Library. Stacy was hoping that there might be more to see somewhere, and Ron was wondering, how to access them.
So there was much at the New York Public Library. It's in their Rare Books and Manuscripts division, which is kind of at the end of the Rose Reading Room in the main branch. There's this little gilded chocolate box of a room that getting into is exceptionally difficult. So you need to, make an application to see these things. Many of the files are privacy protected because there's details of women who have been admitted up until about the late 1900s. So yeah, even through the 80s and 90s, I think they're still quite protected. So researchers can have access if those applications are successful. I think a lot of pictures and articles are available if you're a New York Public Library member. So, and they're all online, not all online, but there's much of it is online. So you can do, with a normal library membership, search for the newspaper archives. Their digitized New York history collection has wonderful images from the neighborhood, and also, Hopper is in there, and you do a search for either, Isaac T. Hopper or Hopper Home or Women's Prison Association, and there's just this rich trove of material that, anyone who's a library member can access. The archives are, more closely guarded because of the privacy concerns, but also because they're so old now that many of the pages, to read them is to destroy them. The paper is often as thin as a potato chip, and you turn it and that's gone. So it's a really involved process to go through that material. Ideally, it would all be digitized, but that takes an enormous amount of time and money.
So if anyone knows someone who has a grant that would allow us to hire someone to do that, let us know.
This is worthwhile. Yeah, but I would start off with kind of just a search through their massive online holdings at the library.
And is that how you started your research? Jill is curious about the process of your research.
So it's so long ago. I don't know how I started the research. Yeah, I think I started I always start kind of with something that I've seen in the world. It's not really it's something that strikes me when I'm out and about, and it's something that I have to know more about. It's just, I don't think like as a researcher or journalistically at that point. It's just really a question of me as a person being like, I need to know more about this. So um, I think as part of my PhD research, which was in a quite specialized area of criminal law, it involved looking at something which led me to these to the Women's Prison Association, and it was from there that I kept returning to this remarkable institution that I just couldn't believe had been doing the same thing for so long. So I think it's a process of one thing leading to another that led me there. And it's not just at the New York Public Library; it's also the Historical Society. And a few other research institutions that kind of have relevant materials. But you could spend your whole life chasing all the rabbits down all the holes. At some point, you really have to narrow in. So history buffs will feel me.
Very, very true. So Jill had a question about the WPA's relationship with Middle Collegiate Church, and I sort of pinged up when you mentioned the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, because we just had an event with Janice Nimura, who's the Blackwell sisters biographer, and they're the Blackwell sisters are the ones who started the New York Infirmary, and it made me curious in general just about the other institutions, organizations, communities in the neighborhood that the WPA has been involved with over the years.
Yeah, the Middle Collegiate Church have been, and I'm going to have to do my research now. I think 1890s was when it was built. So we moved into that location. Sarah mentioned our third location in 1874, which is why we feel so connected to her. The building is a she. And the Middle Collegiate Church built their sanctuary a decade or so after that. So we've been neighbors for an extremely long time. We've weathered many storms together. The Middle Collegiate Church is actually, ironically, when other emergencies have occurred, such as other fires and the gas explosion, Middle Collegiate Church is where our residents and staff have gone. We do have that symbiotic relationship, and after the fire, they were incredibly generous in their amplification about who we are, why it's important, because we realized that a lot of folks didn't know who we are. And honestly, I think when people walked past our building, they thought we were part of the church, or they just didn't, take the time to wonder who we were. Directly after the fire, we even had a handful of folks from the church take the women shopping, because I believe they were evacuated at about 5 a.m. in the morning in an emergency. So women left in what they were wearing in their sleep and grabbed a handful of things, and that wasn't much. And so they didn't have anything. And so the church actually took the women out to get new essentials. And Arielle, you asked about our relationships with other organizations. When you've been on Second Avenue for as long as we have, we kind of consider ourselves like the informal mayors and mayoresses of the East Village. So yeah, we do have great relationships with a lot of businesses, a lot of individuals. There's really something special about East Village Proud. And I think a lot of creativity and inclusivity, that's just part of the East Village spirit. So I mentioned the 8 Ball community. They were the ones that created our mural. They have had locations in the East Village, and as have a lot of other arts organizations. We do try our best to be good neighbors, and I think we are more often than not. The fact that people didn't know that we were a 38-bed shelter for women, most people didn't know that, I think is proof that our place is cemented and valuable, and that's yes. Small plug. There are a couple of places that are really have been especially supportive, and this is a new-ish organization called the Swiss Institute. It's where one of the 2 Chase banks within 3 blocks of the East Village used to be, and now it's the Swiss Institute. That's an amazing
on the corner of St. Mark's.
Yep, on the corner of St. Mark's. They've hired WPA women. They've allowed us to use the space. Yeah, they're great neighbors.
That's so great. Yeah, I saw some really beautiful art there before the pandemic happened. We have a couple of questions about the fire. Was most of what was inside able to be preserved in terms of all of the, archive or historic items? And my question is, as you are considering renovations, what are your dreams for what that space might look like in the future?
Sure, I'll answer the first question. The vast majority of the damage that has happened to Hopper Home on 2nd Avenue is going to be smoke damage. We didn't get a ton of fire damage. We actually have a fire wall it's a shared wall between Middle Collegiate and WPA, and the firewall did its job remarkably well.
Amazing.
And we didn't bear the brunt of most of the fire, but we apparently have really severe and deteriorating smoke damage. Fortunately, I can say that all of our archival materials, such as our matron's diary and the deed, and all of those things that we would hate for anything to happen to, they were all removed pretty soon after it happened, because we were allowed in to remove a couple of things, and they're out, they're safe. As far as our vision for the future, if I could wave my magic Harry Potter wand, it would be to have an equitable space that respects women's dignity, and government contracts to fund most of it, and enough private dollars to fill in the gaps.
That's great. Funny, speaking of Harry Potter, we have a question from Lizzie, who is curious if any or all of your programs include trans women.
So at WPA, if you identify as a woman or if you identify as gender non-conforming, you are eligible to participate in any of our services. And so, yes, we do have folks who are transgender in WPA programs.
Thanks for doing that. It's really important.
Absolutely, because women of color, poor women of color, women who have experienced abuse are more likely to be arrested and end up in the criminal justice system. But women who are trans or gender non-conforming are even more at risk. So that it is very important to us that our services are open to folks who need us.
Thanks. We have a question also from Kelly, who says, the history behind New York State Women's Nursery at Bedford Hills is amazing, first in the nation 1901. However, is there any history or current intervention in regard to state sentences and WPA, or maybe collaboration between WPA and re-entry from state as versus Rikers?
Yeah, our focus at WPA now is really different than what it was. As Sarah pointed out, she showed you the police matrons bill, which essentially was legislation advocated by WPA for women to work inside correctional facilities and men and women to not be housed together. When in 1845, we thought that was the right move. In 2021, we don't want to do any work inside walls. We do our best work in the community. It allows women to stay in their communities and be with their kids, and it allows us to look at their their entire lives, all of the circumstances that contributed to their arrest. They're things that we can't do from inside correctional facilities. And so with regard to nursery and women not being separated from their kids, we agree. Women shouldn't be separated from kids, and mums should absolutely not be separated from their newborns. So as much as possible, that's what we advocate for, women to not be incarcerated in the first place. And if I got to wave my magic wand again, Arielle, that would be one of the other spells that I would cast. We would stop turning to punishment as our default response, and instead allow women to define what is right for them and their families, and ensure that they have the resources to do that. And that's never prison and jail.
Yeah. I'm curious actually about the WPA, if the WPA's history intersects at all with the former Women's House of Detention, which used to be right smack dab in the middle of Greenwich Village. Was the WPA involved at all in the closing of the Women's House of Detention?
Is that
anything
Bayview, or
like
is that different?
Is it,
Sorry?
Sorry, Beck, what was that question?
Is the House of Detention, that's the old picture, or is
Oh no, I don't think there was a photo of it.
No.
I mean, I think that by virtue of the luck of having dysfunction on a scale that began to impact women of privilege, the dysfunction that by that late stage had become very public for the Women's House of Detention got a lot of public sympathy, and that was key in it being decommissioned. So while in the 50s and the 60s, you can see women coming in and out of Hopper Home and going to the Women's House of Detention and sharing, appalling stories of what was happening to them there. Or also just like it intrudes kind of in a very soft way of people having like weird experiences of talking through the windows just by on their way to work with women who were incarcerated in there. But I think it's one of the success stories of decarceration in the city, because it started to reach out and affect people who had access to the media in the ways that injustices at all the other local jails and then the broader New York State correctional institutions for women never really bled out in a way that caused public outrage, and uproar. So there is an intersection with it, but it's not, I wouldn't say one of the main injustices that the association has dealt with.
Thanks, understood.
Hellhole, good book to read. Anyone wants to know about that period of the Women's House of Detention, first-hand account, I think in the 60s. I don't think that's in print anymore, but you should be able to get a copy of it pretty cheaply online.
Thanks. I'll write that down. Great. Joanne wants to know, is there another way to help the WPA aside from financially?
Yeah, I can answer that question, Sarah, unless you have a bright idea. There are different ways to join our community. So one, jump on our mailing list if you have not already. Two, start following us on Instagram and help us get to 10,000 followers. That is not a frivolous goal. It has a real functionality. Once WPA gets to 10,000 followers, we can apply to be verified, which is important. It elevates us in that digital space, but it also allows us to unlock some functionality that is not available to WPA right now. You can also amplify our messages. So if you're following us online, there are often calls to action or great stories that we would encourage you to share with folks in your network, and especially around alternatives to incarceration and diversion. As your conversations about reframing justice or on how we achieve public safety, around those conversations, closing Rikers. We encourage you to learn about our alternative to incarceration program and why that really is. It's the fiscal smart choice, it's the ethical smart choice to work with women in the community at the front end of criminal justice involvement, rather than waiting for them to get arrested and then punish them and have a felony record, which has a ton of devastating effects. So yes, donating is super important, but there are other ways to join our community.
Thanks. So important. Okay, we have one. I'm gonna wrap it. I think we just have one question, Sarah, about when your book is coming out.
So, well, I was supposed to be researching at the Historical Society over the last few months. So when I can safely come back and continue that research, I'm hoping in the next 2 or 3 years, but we are now unsurprisingly behind. But actually, I kind of like that as well, because I get longer to marinate in all of the archival material. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, just to let all of you know, as we've been talking about various things, I've been collecting links to books and videos and all of the things that you've mentioned. So I'm going to send out an email with all of those links in it once the event is over. Also with our follow-up survey, which if you have a couple minutes to fill that out, we greatly appreciate it. It's just to gather more feedback and ideas about our public programs and how to make them better. So thanks for that. And then later we'll send out the video of this evening's event once it's up on our YouTube page. So thank you. Are there any other things that you would want to mention, either of you, that we didn't touch on this evening yet?
I didn't thank either of you, so thank you both very much. Neither of you are employees of WPA, so you volunteered your expertise and your time. Yeah, we really appreciate that. Thank you.
There was just one thing that I'm just always aware of, like the more you learn about this in historical perspective and from a policy perspective now, the more clear it becomes the ways in which we are all interconnected when it comes to our communities and questions of public safety and crime and health inequality in our health systems. And listening to these stories is the first part of kind of having not the empathetic response, but the correct response to how we become stronger communities together. And I spent 6 months learning from the women at Hopper before I did a little bit of research on an unrelated thing. And I saw that my great-grandfather, when he arrived from Poland, his first New York was in the apartment that backs onto Hopper Home from 7th Avenue. And it was just, I had never known that. And then he met my grandmother and they moved to the Bronx. But it was that, every day when I was leaving Hopper, it was like a salmon swimming upstream. And in a sense, like, you don't need something like that, which is, fortuitous and serendipitous and odd to know, but like, we are all like, this matter concerns us all. There's nothing kind of voyeuristic or weird or bad about any of this, where it's much more, these stories have at their heart something that's familiar to everybody. And so, it might be talking about the history of crime and punishment, but it really is just a human history of our communities. So I'd encourage you to think of it like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's such a great reminder, and I think a great way to end our evening. So I'm so grateful to everyone at the WPA and to you, Sarah, for being here with us from tomorrow, and to all of you who are here with us this evening. Thank you so much, and take good care of you and yours.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, bye.